All right, it is time. It is time to continue on with the course, everybody. Congratulations on surviving the exam and being willing to sit in on the second half of the day with me on the new material. Uh, it shows a lot of backbone, a lot of good character, and it's always appreciated. So thank you for that. I'll talk all about the exam next week once it's graded, once the curve has revealed itself, and everybody knows where you stand. I didn't see a lot of like happy faces in the crowd, so that generally is a sign that it's going to be a relatively generous curve. I don't know though; you never know. This morning's exam, I made all the exams before the semester even started, so it has nothing to do with anyone. But apparently this morning's exam maybe was a little bit easier. I don't know. We'll see. But things seem to be going well as I was grading them. So hopefully that will be the case with you as well. Just overall in general, as far as like, a solid like average for the class, and then like everybody that's putting in a decent amount of effort getting something out of that. So but again, like that's stuff that will be addressed once it all is done, and it'll be done as soon as I can get it done. So I'm gonna be grading all day tomorrow. We'll see what happens. So I'll keep you posted as soon as I have the grades done. I'll email all of you. I'll post your score to Moodle, and then I'll have also like a sheet that explains the curve, and you can figure out how you did relative to the rest of the class, and then kind of figure out where you should go from here. But as far as the course goes, it's time to move forward. So we've been looking at the demand side of the market and kind of doing some in-depth sort of investigation of like the mechanisms behind the demand curve via the rational consumer choice model of chapter 4. Also like various extensions on just demand in general via the statistical analysis, the elasticity analysis, the sort of way to gauge the efficiency of the market via the measuring of consumer and producer surplus, all that stuff. All right, so now we've turned a corner and we're going to head into the supply territory. What is going on behind the supply curve? And so in order to do that, it's a little bit more complicated than demand because, production is complicated. Firms have to deal with all sorts of things, and they have to ultimately figure out if it's profitable or not to produce. And so in order to do that, you have to figure out, well, what are the relevant costs that they have to consider? In order to understand that, you have to develop a general framework to model the production process. So then that's where we start here. We start with the production process. So chapter 5 is about the production process that gets us to the costs. So today we will focus specifically on the production function, which is a way to model the process of getting inputs through some sort of production process to result into outputs, and sort of the nature of that and how that can tell us what we need to know about the costs that firms face, so then we can compare that to the benefits that firms get from the market, which is revenue, selling, price times quantity, and then identifying optimal behavior for firms in a variety of market settings, the most competitive to the least competitive to the in-between cases. So that's basically the rest of the course. And so everything we do now is going to be relevant throughout the remainder of our days together. So it's really important for you to just get on top of the ideas now, and then to start to build your understanding of them from this point. Try not to sort of miss an important component, especially like the stuff we covered today. This is like foundational for everything else. So just make sure that you don't kind of like just at any point kind of drop the ball and then try to like jump back in, because if you do, you're going to be lost. So you have to just kind of start at the beginning and kind of go with it and stick with it throughout the entire process. And if you do, you'll understand everything moving forward, and things should work out well for you. So like I said, today we're going to start by modeling the production process, and then the chapter is fairly long, so we'll cover stuff today, and then we'll finish it next week. But next week it'll take up the entire period to cover the rest of the chapter. And somewhere in there, be it at the end of today or beginning of next time, I'll cover just a brief review of derivatives, because we will be taking derivatives in this section. So I'll just cover a brief review of kind of like the mechanics of taking derivatives of different functions that will be relevant moving forward. All right. And also, I'll just quickly touch upon like the properties of exponents as well, so that you can be reminded of how to work with exponents, because we'll be doing some of that stuff as well to be able to solve for the stuff we're looking to solve for. All right, so in this chapter, we're going to explain alternative ways of measuring the productivity of inputs and the role of the manager in the production process. We're going to calculate input demand and the cost minimizing combination of inputs, and use isoquant analysis to illustrate optimal input substitution. So essentially, as firm managers, like beyond like the abstract sort of models that we're going to be looking at, like obviously in practice, you're going to want to figure out, well, how do I actually accomplish the things that we talk about in this sort of theoretical space that we present the ideas in. And so part of this whole thing is kind of linking the ideas to practice. Like, how can you choose the inputs that are going to minimize your costs, both in the short run and the long run. So there'll be different ways of kind of approaching that. And in the long run, short run, which I'll talk about the distinction between those two pretty soon. The long run is going to use a framework that's going to be very similar to the rational consumer choice model framework that had the indifference curves and the budget constraints. It'll be similar as far as how it works, but it'll be from the standpoint of the firm deciding how much labor and capital to use in order to minimize their costs. So if you did like kind of, to a decent extent, like absorb the basic mechanics of that last model we covered, then that should help you out here as well. We're going to calculate a cost function from a production function, explain how economic costs differ from accounting costs. So again, just highlight the difference between costs, where again, with economic costs, we're talking about opportunity costs that involve both explicit and implicit costs versus just accounting costs that have just the explicit costs accounted for. And so once we establish the nature of production and sort of all the mechanics of that, then we will take it to the cost functions. And once we have the cost functions, and we can start to analyze like optimal behavior past this chapter. But the chapters 6 and 7 are a little bit less theoretical, a little bit more practical. The chapter 6 kind of deals with like, how do you in practice actually buy the inputs you need in markets to minimize your costs. And then chapter 7 deals with like the nature of industry. How are industries organized? Why are some industries more competitive than others? We'll look at different aspects of that. And then in chapter 8, which will be the last chapter of the second part of the course, we start to apply the framework to the optimal decision making, the profit maximizing behavior of firms in like competitive markets and monopolies, and then that'll get us to the end of the second part of the course. And then beyond that, we'll start talking about oligopolies, which are the most complicated market settings in which you have a few large firms dominating the market, and the decisions they make are not just based on what they do, it's also based on what their opponents do. And so there's a dimension of interdependency that has to be considered, which complicates the situation enough that we have different models to deal with that situation. So it becomes more complicated. So there's like 2 chapters that we cover in the last part of the course to cover just that case, which is the most practical case, because in reality, most firms operate in oligopoly structures. Most industries that all of us buy stuff from that we know about are oligopolies. The film industry is an oligopoly. The airline industry is an oligopoly. Most things that you know of that have like a few sort of big name brands that kind of like define that industry for us are oligopolies. And so most firms that matter in the world operate in those markets, and therefore it's the most important setting to consider, and the more insights we can gain into it, the better. We're always trying to develop new models to try to understand that behavior better, and so we'll just touch upon some of that stuff towards the end of the course. But again, it's all very much connected. So as far as this course goes, this chapter goes, once we have set up the production framework and have talked about like uh, selecting the right inputs in order to maximize output and minimize costs, we will start talking about the costs that we consider the most important, which are the fixed costs, sunk costs, variable costs, and marginal costs. Um, we'll calculate average and marginal costs from algebraic or tabular cost data and illustrate the relationship between average and marginal costs. Distinguish between short-run and long-run production decisions, and illustrate the impact on costs and economies of scale. So basically every issue you can think of related to the relationship between cost and production we will consider. And so there's definitely a lot to think about, but if you understand it all, it's pretty cool. Like it all kind of comes together in a very tight system, and then it provides you like important economic intuition, just like the market model does, about how price and quantity are affected by different changes in the market. This kind of framework, if you understand it and kind of have it in your head, can help you to truly understand like how businesses can thrive in any setting, given a variety of circumstances. So this is like the starting point of just kind of knowing how to best succeed as a business, and of course, by very close extension, as a manager of a business. So we'll conclude the last part. We'll consider a multiple output production process exhibiting economies of scope or cost complementarities, and explain their significance for managerial decisions. So don't worry about that. We'll talk about it when we get to it. I'll talk all about that next week. But let's just jump into this chapter. So the chapter provides the economic foundations needed to succeed in managerial positions such as production and pricing management. The concepts of production costs are presented here and serve as the basic building blocks for business areas that include human resources, operations, managerial accounting, and strategic management. Basically everything I said already. All right, let's get into the meat of it. All right, so the production function. So this is essentially like the model that is like the heart of the theory of the firm from economics, that again is the backbone of everything we talk about moving forward. So we'll see how a manager can exploit an existing technology to its greatest potential. And then in later chapters, we'll analyze the decision to improve a technology. So here we're going to assume that a production process exists, and that's it. Like it is what it is, and it's not changing within this chapter. So to begin our analysis, consider a production process that just utilizes two inputs. So we only consider two inputs in this class. So we put everything into those two categories. One of them is, of course, labor, which is just workers. And then the other one is capital. Capital is just a catch-all term for basically anything not labor used to produce. In practice, capital is generally, just like people-made production items, such as like factories and machines, things that people use to produce that have been made by other people. So notation-wise, we'll let K denote the quantity of capital, and we'll let L denote the quantity of labor used to produce. And then Q is the level of output produced in the production process. And just a reminder, the general ideas presented here are valid for any two inputs. So the relationships, as we'll study them, do extend beyond just a simple case that we're considering. All right, so the production process is an engineering relation that defines a maximum amount of output that can be produced with a given set of inputs. Mathematically, the production function is denoted as this expression here, where you have quantity as a function of the two main inputs we're considering, which are capital and labor. So again, this is just a general specification of that relationship that can take on different mathematical forms, just like the demand functions that we looked at, where quantity demanded was a function of the price of its own good, the price of a related good, the incomes, etc. So this is just, again, the starting point to relate the variables that affect the dependent variables. These are the what we call exogenous variables, and this is the endogenous variable, the one that's being affected by the variables that are changing. So it is the maximum amount of output that can be produced with K units of capital and L units of labor. All right, now let's talk about the distinction between the short run and the long run. So in your economics courses, you've heard these terms before. They have very precise definitions within the context that you are dealing with. In macroeconomics, you can talk about the short run and the long run. Generally, we're talking about the time period that it takes for the economy to adjust to get back into like its potential output. So that concept is different from what we talk about in microeconomics. In microeconomics, when we talk about the short run, we're talking about a period of time in which at least one input into production is fixed. So there's at least one input that cannot be varied. So let's say, a firm, got signed a lease for a factory and they're in there for a year. So their capital is fixed for a year. Their factory is their capital. And because they are in that period incapable of expanding their factory space or getting out of the lease, then they are, by definition, in the short run. And once they're out of that lease and they're able to, change the size of their factory, then they are once again in the long run. So as a manager, your job is to use the available production function as efficiently as possible. You have to determine how much of each input to use to produce output. In the short run, some factors of production will be fixed, and this limits your choice in making input decisions. If your factory's fixed, all you can do to change your output is to change the amount of workers you have. That's it. So your variable input is your only means of expanding your output. And again, you are limited by the fact that you are in the short run. There is a factor of production that is fixed. So the short run is defined as a time frame in which there are fixed factors of production. Suppose capital and labor are the only two inputs in production and that the level of capital is fixed in the short run, and that's generally what we'll assume. The capital is the input that's fixed. I think there's one homework problem that considers a fixed labor level, but in general, we're going to consider the case of capital being the one that is fixed. So the only short-run input-output decision to be made by a manager is how much labor to utilize, as I mentioned. So in the short run, the production function is only a function of labor. Labor is the only variable input, and so output is only a function of one variable, which is labor. So we fix capital at some level, and we just denoted K star. So the short-run production function may be then written as this relationship here, the relationship between quantity as being a function of some fixed level of capital and labor. The long run is defined as the horizon over which the manager can adjust all factors of production. So that is, it's a temporary space for a manager because let's say you are finally in the long run, you're able to expand your factory. As soon as you do get a new factory that's bigger, you're once again in a short run. It's a different short run. Now you have more space, and that does change your ability to produce, but each time you change your fixed output, you are once again in a short run situation. But the long run is the time period in which you can vary all of your inputs. And these are going to have, these ideas are going to have a lot of implications when it comes to overall costs and how big firms can get and ultimately how competitive different industries are. So these very seemingly simple concepts are at the heart of like why industry is so varied as far as like its competitiveness and the size of the different firms, etc. All right, so the starting point to get to that overall understanding is to establish some measures of productivity. So an important component of managerial decision making is to determine the determination of the productivity of inputs used in the production process. How productive is your capital? How productive is your labor? These measures are useful for evaluating the effectiveness of a production process and for making input decisions that maximize profits. So the three most important measures of productivity are total product, the total amount of output, average product, the average amount of output per unit of input, and the marginal product, the extra amount of output produced by employing one additional unit of your input. So the total product, let's focus on that, is simply the maximum level of output that can be produced with a given amount of inputs. The average product, so in many instances, managerial decision makers are interested in average productivity of an input. There's different reasons why you would need to focus on average product versus the marginal product, which will become clear later. But both measures are important and they are certainly related. So average product of an input is defined as the total product divided by the quantity used of the input. So the average product of labor is denoted AP subscript L there. And it is, of course, the amount of output divided by the amount of laborers, average product of labor. The average product of capital is, of course, we'll denote it AP subscript K and is equal to the amount of output divided by the quantity of capital units that are being used. All right, now marginal product. Marginal product is, like I mentioned, the extra amount of output produced by employing one more unit of a productive input, either capital or labor. And it's also the derivative of the production function with respect to the input that we're considering. So that's where the derivatives will start to become important. So just in general, as far as like the definition, the marginal product of an input in the change is a change in total output attributable to the last unit of an input. The marginal product of capital, therefore, is a change in total output divided by the change in capital. So if you change capital by 1 unit, how much does output change? So you're at some level of capital and you want to figure out, should I employ one more unit of capital? Well, let me look at the marginal product of that, which will be the benefit of employing that additional unit. And we'll get more specific about that in a bit. The marginal product of labor is the change in total output divided by the change in labor. So again, we're using triangles to represent change, but essentially what we're saying is that these marginal products are the basically derivatives of the production function with respect to capital and labor. All right, so here we have just a tabular representation of a production function, and we are in the short run here because our capital is fixed. So that's our first column here. Capital is fixed at 2 units, and regardless of the amount of output that's produced, which is on column 4, the amount of capital is fixed. So we are in the short run because of that. Again, that defines the short run. If there's a fixed input into production, we are in the short run. And therefore, the only way to affect output is to change our variable input, which is labor. So going from 0 laborers to 1 laborer, the change in labor, which is column 3, tells us that we are employing 1 more unit of labor. And the output by employing 1 more unit of labor goes from 0 to 76. And therefore, the marginal product of labor, the extra amount of output produced by employing 1 unit of labor, is 76. And of course, the average product of labor tells us the average amount of output for all the amount of laborers that we have, right? On average, how much is each one producing? And obviously, when there's just one, it's going to be the 76 as well. So marginal product and average product will be equal, obviously, for that first unit. All right, second unit. Second laborer hired, change in labor, obviously 1. Output increases from 76 units to 248 units. So the marginal product of labor is 172 units. The extra amount of output produced by employing that second laborer, the marginal product of that second laborer is 172 units. And averages will take in a new value, and if the new value is larger than the existing average, it brings up the average, right? just like your grades, right? You have a certain amount of grade points. You add an A, 4 more points, divided by however many grades you have, and of course adding that one extra grade, and then that gets you to the new grade point average. So the average product obviously is going to work the same way. So you can think of the marginal product of labor as like extra grade points, and then the average product of labor being grade point average, working the same way as far as like the numerical mechanics of it. So again, marginal product of labor greater than average product of labor brought the average product of labor up. So at 2 laborers, we have average product of labor to be 124. So as we're expanding the production process and hiring more and more laborers in order to produce more output, we see that the marginal product of labor is increasing. So it goes from 76 to 172, then 244. So we see that it is increasing, but eventually it kind of levels out. So it gets to 316, and then it kind of stays there, and then it starts to diminish after that. So that's an important characteristic, and I'll talk about why that happens in a second. And average product of labor, as the marginal product of labor is increasing, average product of labor is also increasing, but then marginal product of labor starts to decrease, but it's still larger than average product of labor, so it continues to bring average product up, and then eventually they are equivalent. So marginal product of labor equals the average product of labor, and then after that, the average product of labor starts to decrease as well. We'll look at this graphically again right now. Don't worry, and like highlight why it is I'm pointing these things out. There's an important pattern here that is based on some assumptions that I haven't mentioned yet. But what's important to understand from here is that the only way to expand output is to increase the amount of labor. The amount of labor is dealing with a fixed amount of capital. So no matter how many workers you hire, they have to just keep working with the same amount of capital, be it the same amount of machines, same amount of buildings, whatever. That's essentially eventually going to create a barrier to them improving their efficiency, like the extra amount of output they can produce. And then also marginal product will increase, but then eventually start to decrease, and that will eventually start to decrease the average product of labor as well. All right, so if we were to, so that's, again, when you're looking at like a tabular representation of these relationships, you're looking at what's called a discrete case of a set of relationships, where you're looking at just whole numbers, and you can just have them represented in a table. But when you're looking at the continuous case, when you're looking at all possible numerical values, even like decimal values, anything between the integers, anything between the larger numbers, you represent things graphically. And so that's what we're doing here. We've got our total product curve, which again represents the total amount of output that can be produced as we employ more units of our variable input, which is labor. So we have labor on the x-axis. And then on the y-axis, if we're looking at the total product curve, then we're going to look at total product. If we're looking at the marginal product, we'll look at marginal product, and we're looking at average product, we'll look at average product. So the figure shows graphically the relationship amongst total product, marginal product, and average product. The first thing to notice is that total product increases and its slope gets steeper as we move from point A to point E. So the reason for this is based on an assumption that we make about just like a very general production process. So imagine a general production process where a company has just been set up. You maybe bought your assembly lines, you've bought you've gone into a lease for the building, or maybe bought the real estate, and you've hired your first person. So the first person starts to produce, but like the Gesundheit, obviously the one person can't do everything by themselves. Like they can't produce, they can't engineer the machinery to work properly and just maintain everything and run the books, etc. So of course, you're going to hire more people. As you hire more people, then the extra amount of output you can gain from additional people is going to increase initially because of that. You're dividing up labor, you're specializing, and that's causing um, increased efficiency in the production process, which means that your marginal product of labor, the extra amount of output that you gain from hiring additional laborers, is actually increasing initially because of that, because of the division of labor. So we see that between A and E, here's our marginal product curve. And again, it represents the additional amount of output produced by employing additional units of labor. And it is also the slope of our total product curve. So at any given point, the slope tells us at that point, if you were to hire one more unit of labor, how much extra output could they produce, the marginal product of labor. So that is plotted as its own curve down here. So we see between A and E, a few more people are being hired, the tasks are being divided, efficiency is being achieved, and so the marginal product of labor is increasing over that initial range. But then something happens at point E. What happens at point E is that the fixed input starts to become a hindrance, right? Like there's only so many machines to go around. There's only so much space in the factory. So people start getting in each other's way. Like you hire more people, more output is being produced, but like there just isn't enough of the productive resources, the fixed capital, to increase the extra if the marginal product anymore. And so the extra amount of output employed produced by employing additional units after point E is going to be positive, but it's going to start diminishing. So we're going to see diminishing marginal product past this point on the production function, which is our total product curve. So initially, marginal product increases as we move from point A to point E. The range over which marginal product increases is known as the range of increasing marginal returns. So again, over that initial amount of folks that are being hired that are dividing up the tasks, specializing, the marginal product is increasing, and so we have increasing marginal returns to labor. And then again, at that point E, the marginal product reaches its maximum. It doesn't become negative right away, but it does start to diminish, meaning each additional person you hire will produce less than the last person hired. So as the usage of labor increases from the 5th through the 10th unit, so all the way to the point where marginal product does become 0 and eventually start to become negative, total output will continue to increase over that range, but at a decreasing rate. So that's why marginal product declines between 5 and 10, but is still positive. So the range over which marginal product is positive but declining is known as the range of decreasing or diminishing marginal returns to labor. So again, it means that extra folks are being hired, they're producing more output, but they're not producing as much output as the last person hired, and that pattern continues on. We have diminishing marginal returns to labor. And then finally, it becomes so bad, like you hired just so many people, that the extra amount of output beyond this point here, beyond 10 workers, that an additional person can produce is actually going to be negative. They're going to start getting in the way of even just producing it all. So notice the marginal product becomes negative when more than 10 units of labor are employed. The range over which marginal product is negative is known as negative marginal return. So that's the range over which the production process yields negative marginal returns. And again, that means that each additional unit of labor will actually decrease the overall production because there's just no way to become any more efficient. There's just no room for it. So this is a very general production process, and we need to be very general about it in order to be very general about like the costs that firms incur as a result of these patterns. In practice, you'll find variations on these patterns, but this is the benchmark case. This is the most common case, and so it's the one that we use to build the intuition with, and it's the one that you should sort of just ascribe to, the most amount of sort of importance, and then beyond that, you can think about reality, and then kind of compare it to this, and then kind of maybe build some intuition on how you deal with realistic situations. All right, so that just establishes the phases of the marginal return. So as the usage of an input increases, marginal product initially increases over the range where you have increasing marginal returns, then begins to decline where you have decreasing marginal returns, and eventually becomes negative when you have negative marginal returns. All right, so what is the role of the manager in the production process? Well, the manager's role is in the production process is twofold. One is you want to ensure that the firm operates on the production function. So you have this production function, you understand the relationship between your inputs and your output, the fact that your one input is fixed, and that you're doing the best you can with your variable input, which is generally going to be labor. You understand that you're going to hit that wall of diminishing marginal returns, and so the best thing that you can do is just to kind of keep an eye on it, but definitely to make sure that your workers are on the production function, because if they're not operating on the production function, then all the intuition is lost at that point, and you won't really understand what's happening. And then the other main role is to ensure that the firm uses the correct level of input. So at some point it's going to become apparent that you're going to have decreasing returns, and then at that point, like, you should definitely be expanding the amount of fixed capital you have to be able to basically shift your production function. All right, so to produce in the production function, the first managerial role is one of the most difficult for a manager to perform, because again, it involves people. Like you need to get people to work at a certain level. So the production process describes the maximum possible output that can be produced with given inputs. For the case of labor, this means the workers must be putting forth maximal effort. To ensure that workers are working at full potential, the manager must institute an incentive structure that induces them to put forth the desired level of effort. So, that's where it becomes tricky, and definitely can be useful for you guys to kind of bring in some of the other information and intuition you have from your other management courses, for those of you that are management majors, to try to achieve that. So the manager of a restaurant has to institute an incentive scheme that ensures that food servers do a good job of waiting on tables. Most restaurants pay workers low wages but allow them to collect tips, which effectively provides a worker with an incentive to perform well on the job. So that's just an example of like how you could create incentives for workers that align their interests with the interests of the firm. Like if they're doing well for the firm, then in this case, obviously in the simplest case, like they are being rewarded for it by the customers. But obviously different job contexts require different approaches, but the idea is the same. Like it's about aligning those interests, which we'll talk about more in, I think, the next chapter. I think it is the next chapter. All right. More generally, many firms institute profit-sharing plans to provide workers with an incentive to produce on the production function. Okay, so it is chapter 6 is the next one. So a more detailed discussion of this role of the manager is presented in the next chapter. Using the right level of inputs, though, that's the one that we can address more technically here. So the second role of the manager is to ensure that the firm operates at the right point on the production function. For a restaurant manager, that means hiring the correct number of servers. So assume that output produced by a firm can be sold, let's say, at a market price of $3. So there's just a certain amount of demand in the market, certain amount of supply. They meet in some equilibrium. They establish a price of $3 for the market, and your firm just kind of takes that as given. If each unit of labor costs $400, then the question is, how many units of labor should the manager hire to maximize profit. So that's a how much question. It's a how many question. Whenever we're dealing with those questions in economics, we have to consider marginal benefits and marginal costs. What is the extra amount of benefit that can be gained from hiring an additional worker versus what is the additional cost incurred by hiring an additional worker? To answer the question, we must first determine the benefit of hiring an additional worker. Each worker increases the firm's output by his or her marginal product. You hire an additional person, they produce an additional amount of output. And this increase in output can be sold at the market price. In this case, we assume it to be $3. So the benefit to the firm of each unit of labor is going to be equal to the extra amount of output produced by the additional labor, the marginal product of labor, times the amount the output they produce can be sold at, which in this case is $3. So this is what we call the value of marginal product of labor. It is the benefit of hiring additional workers. The value of the marginal product of an input is the value of the output produced by the last unit of that input. Generally, if each unit of output can be sold at a price of, let's say, P, so let's take a general now out of that specific $3 market price and just say there's some price that the goods can be sold at. The value of the marginal product of labor is therefore going to be, we denoted VMPL, value of marginal product of labor. It equals, again, the price of the output times the amount of output produced by employing one additional unit of labor, also known as the marginal product of labor. And the value of the marginal product of capital, same idea. If you were to consider employing an additional unit of capital, be it an additional assembly line, be it an additional factory, who knows? Whatever it is your capital is, you're going to consider the benefit of employing an additional unit, which again is going to be the value of the additional output you can produce by that additional unit of the input, in this case capital. So it's going to be the price of the good that's produced times the extra amount of the good that's produced by employing one more unit of your capital, the marginal product of capital. So that's the value of the marginal product of capital. That's the value of the marginal product of labor. In our example, the cost to the firm of an additional unit of labor, we're going to assume is $400. All right, so here's our production function again. Here's us starting out with 0 laborers and then increasing them incrementally by 1 unit. The price of output doesn't change. The marginal product of labor, again, is here telling us that the first unit got us an additional 76 units of output. The second one got us an additional 172 units of output, and so on and so forth. We have that range of increasing returns up until the 5th laborer, and the 6th actually is where it kind of just levels out between the 5th and the 6th. And then beyond that, we see that the marginal product of labor starts to diminish. So we have that range of diminishing returns beyond the 6th labor. Again, that means that the marginal product of labor is positive, but it is decreasing. Each additional unit is producing less output than the last unit hired. And then eventually you get into that range of negative returns, which in this case is achieved by hiring the 11th worker. So that's our marginal product of labor. Here's the price. If we multiply them, we'll get our value of our marginal product of labor, which is this column here. So again, hiring that first person means that you can produce additional output worth $228 in market value and what it can be sold for. Hiring the 5th worker yields $948 in the value of marginal product of labor. So the additional output they produce is $948 worth of goods that can be sold. So that's the benefit of hiring a worker, and here's the cost, right? And the cost is constant at the $400 salary per worker that's hired. So again, first worker costs $400, second worker costs $400, and so on and so forth. So we have to compare the value of the marginal product of labor to the wage to be able to identify how many workers should this firm hire in order to be at their cost minimizing, profit maximizing level of the input. So we can see that even at the point where we have those diminishing returns, and marginal product of labor starts to diminish, the value of the marginal product of labor still exceeds the cost of an additional worker, right? So the benefit of hiring additional workers still outweighs the cost over the diminishing returns range. And the 10th worker is the one where the extra benefit of hiring that person becomes less than the extra cost of hiring that person. We see that the value of the marginal product of that 10th worker is $228 worth of goods that they can produce, but of course the cost of hiring that worker is $400, and therefore the marginal benefit, the extra benefit gain from employing one more worker is outweighed by the marginal cost, the extra cost incurred by hiring one more worker, and therefore it doesn't make sense to hire that 11th worker, the 10th worker, sorry. And therefore the optimal amount of workers to hire in this example is going to be 9 workers, right? It's the point at which the value of the marginal product of labor is higher, or is equal to or higher than the wage, the extra cost of hiring additional work. Any questions on these concepts? Yeah. Right. But if you just think about it in terms of like, let me just think about like the extra benefit and the extra cost of hiring additional people. Like, even though, yes, the difference between the two is the greatest there, if you hire that 7th person, you're still going to get like value from that person. They're still going to produce, in this case, $476 more in output than they're going to cost you to hire them. And so it makes sense to hire them. So even though that level of output, in this case, six units of labor, will get you to the highest amount of value of marginal product of labor, the highest amount of net benefit from hiring a worker, you can still benefit and make some. Ultimately, you're going to wind up making profits as a result of that. So make profits because of the differential between what it costs you to hire a person versus the benefit. So it's all about looking at the next unit, not just overall like how like which one maximizes like the difference between the two. Just, it doesn't make sense to hire one more. The only way we can answer that is by looking at the extra benefit versus the extra cost of hiring one more person. If that's a positive amount, then it makes sense to hire the person because you are saving money and getting some benefit from that, which is revenue, which increases your profits. All right, so that's the profit maximizing input usage principle. To maximize profits, a manager should use inputs at levels at which the marginal benefit equals the marginal cost, specifically when the cost of each additional unit of labor is W. The manager should continue to employ labor up to the point where the value of the marginal product of labor equals the wage in the range of diminishing marginal product. The profit maximizing input usage rule defines the demand for an input by a profit maximizing firm. So it defines the willingness to hire folks. So here we've got our value of our marginal product of labor curve. Again, it reflects the nature of our marginal product of labor. Remember, marginal product of labor was increasing over the increasing returns range, then decreasing over the diminishing returns range. And so if you just multiply that by the price that you can sell the output at, you're going to get that same relationship, that same hump-shaped relationship, which is our value of a marginal product of labor. And so over the decreasing range, that's essentially going to be the demand for labor curve of the firm. So, at various prices, which is the wage, the firm is going to demand different amounts of labor. And this is going to be the point at which this particular firm is going to stop. They're going to stop at the point where the value of the marginal product of labor is equal to the wage. And it has to be over the decreasing range, because over here, we know that when you have the increasing returns, that even though here the value of the marginal product of labor is equal to the wage, that hiring an additional person will actually increase the value of the marginal product of labor. And therefore, the extra benefit of hiring a person will be greater than the cost. So only when you get into that diminishing returns range does it become sensible to stop at this point where the value of the marginal product of labor is equal to the wage, because hiring one more person will decrease the marginal product of labor, which will decrease the value of the marginal product of labor, which will make the extra benefit of hiring an additional person less than the cost. I mean, more than the cost, less than the cost. All right, so when the wage is W naught, this one that we see here, the profit maximizing quantity of labor is going to be L naught there, such that the value of the marginal product of labor is equal to the wage in the range of diminishing marginal returns. So that's how a firm figures out the optimal amount of a variable input to hire. They compare the marginal benefit to the marginal cost, which again involves looking at this relationship here. So in the figure we see, again, the profit maximizing level of output is L naught. All right, so the downward sloping portion of the value of the marginal product of labor defines demand for labor by the profit maximizing firm. It shows the relationship between the wage rate and the amount of labor a firm will want to hire at that rate. An important property of the demand for an input is that it slopes downward because of the law of diminishing marginal returns, as I already mentioned. Each additional unit of an input adds less profit than the previous unit. Profit maximizing firms, thus, are willing to pay less for each additional unit of an input along that range there. It's all about just really understanding, again, like the nature of production. So if you understand the nature of production and you understand that you have that increasing returns and then the diminishing returns range, and then that's amount of output can be sold, and then that's how you get the value of the marginal product of labor, then it all kind of becomes clear. All right, so that was the tabular discrete case of a production function. Then we went to the continuous case, which we represented graphically, and now we'll jump into the algebraic forms of production functions. So much like the demand function that we estimated to be linear, the relationship between our inputs and our output can look different ways mathematically. It can be a line, but a line would not capture the complexity that we've assumed that the production process has, and so it has to be a little bit more complicated than that. So until now, we've relied on tables and graphs to illustrate the concepts underlying production. The underlying notion of a production function can be expressed mathematically, and in fact, it's possible to use statistical techniques just like those discussed in Chapter 3 to estimate a particular functional form for a production function. So everything we talked about in Chapter 3 applies here, and it applies to cost functions as well. It applies to any relationships that we study in this class. Statistical analysis can be used to actually figure out what those relationships look like numerically for your specific production process, which will then get you the insights you need to be able to apply the principles that we cover in this course to practical contexts. So we begin with the most simple production function, the linear function of input. So we're going to make simplifying assumptions here about this production process that will allow us to do so. But again, this is not a common case. This is not one that that reflects what we've been talking about so far. It's just like you kind of have to, establish like simple cases in order to build to the more complicated one. So a linear production function can look something like this. It's very simple. You've got capital and labor together. You add them together and you get your amount of output. And each of them have some coefficient that represents In this case, it's going to represent their marginal product. So A and B are going to be constants. With a linear production function, inputs are perfect substitutes, meaning that like they can be substituted for each other in some fixed proportion. So there's a perfect linear relation between all the inputs and total output. So suppose it takes workers at a plant 4 hours to produce what a machine can produce in 1 hour. So that means that a machine is 4 times as productive as a worker. So in that case, the productivity coefficient for capital will be 4, and that coefficient for labor will be 1. So the linear production function will take this form here, again representing the fact that capital is 4 times as productive as labor. So each unit of capital can produce 4 units of output, and each unit of labor can only produce 1 unit of output. So this is the mathematical way of stating that capital is always 4 times as productive as labor. If we were to plug in 5 units of capital and 2 units of labor, then we could figure out that 22 units of output can be produced. So that's just one example of a production function. It's the simplest case. Here's another case of a production function. So again, in the other one, in this case, the inputs are perfect substitutes, meaning like you can substitute capital for labor and you'll get the same result, but of course it depends on the productivity. So you'll need to substitute 1 unit of capital for 4 units of labor in order to maintain your level of output. But you can do it, and they're perfectly substitutable. But you might have a different type of production function, one in which you're not able to do that, and you need to always be increasing both of the inputs into production in order to increase your output. And that type of production process is captured by what's called a Leontief production function. Leontief was like this Russian dude that came up with a lot of different economic things, including this type of production function. And it's represented by this relationship here. What this is basically telling us is that the amount of output that can be produced is going to be the minimum of these 2 numbers. So A and B are constants here. The Leontief production function is called the fixed proportions production function because it implies that inputs are used in fixed proportions. So suppose that you had some weird like word processing company where the job of your firm was to produce letters, I don't know, type up things for people. So it's a word processing firm. Let's say A and B are equal to 1 here, and we can think of K as the number of keyboards and L as the number of keyboarders. The only way you're going to be able to increase the amount of output is to increase both the amount of keyboarders and keyboards. If you just increase the amount of keyboards, that's not going to do anything because you're not going to have anybody to use the keyboards. And if you increase the amount of laborers and there's only 1 keyboard, then that's not going to do anything either. So the inputs have to be increased in fixed proportions. Whereas, again, in the linear case, the inputs are perfectly substitutable. Just depending on their productivity, you'll have to adjust accordingly. But again, these are like the extreme ends of like the spectrum of like the kind of production process that you could wind up with, and then we'll have the most common case that we'll be working with once we get past these 2 cases. So again, we're working with the Leontief production function. The production function implies that 1 keyboarder and 1 keyboard can produce 1 paper per hour. 2 keyboarders and 2 keyboards can produce 2 papers per hour, and so on and so forth. So the Leontief production function is given by, again, that. Okay, this is a duplicate. Okay. All right, sorry, I was trying to fix it, and then I didn't delete the bad one. Anyway, all right, so additional keyboards are useful only to the extent that additional keyboarders are available to use them. Keyboards and keyboarders must be used in fixed proportions for 1 keyboarder per keyboard. All right, so let's do a quick demonstration problem to see how this Leontief production function works. So engineers at the Morris Industries obtained the following estimate for the firm's production function. It's a Leontief production function. It looks like this, so it's not a 1-to-1 relationship anymore. It's basically a 4-to-3 relationship. But they need to be hired in those kind of proportions in order to increase your output. How much output is produced when 2 units of labor and 5 units of capital are employed, given this Leontief production function? So how many units of output are produced? It is not 23. So remember, the minimum of these two numbers. If you have 5 units of capital, how much is being produced here? And then 2 units of labor? 8, right? So what's the minimum of the two? So that's how much you can produce based on the Leontief production function. Make sure you understand this production function and you can figure out, this type of problem. All right, so we calculate, in this case, f of 5, 2. Again, plugging those numbers in gets us to the minimum of 15 and 8. Since the minimum of the numbers 50 and 8 is 8, we know that 5 units of capital and 2 units of labor produce 8 units of output, given this fixed proportions production function, also known as the Leontief production function. So it's one of the extreme cases of a possible production process, and whenever you're talking about anything, you always kind of need to demonstrate like how extreme either end can get before you talk about the most common case. All right, so before we move forward into the most common case, I'm going to do a quick review of managing exponents. I know we have about 9 minutes left. Actually, let's just call it a night, huh? I'll just cut it off. I'll cut it off. I'll stop torturing you guys. Anyway, yeah, let's call it a night, and we'll come back next week, and we'll do a review of exponents, review of derivatives, and then jump into the standard production function we'll be looking at, which is called a Cobb-Douglas production function. And then we'll start looking at taking derivatives and getting marginal products from that production function, and then we'll get to the long run, and then we'll get to costs, and you guys will love it. All right, you guys have a good night. I'm gonna try. Like I said, I'll try to get your scores done for the exam as soon as possible, because I know how rough it is to just kind of sit and wait and not know. So I'll do my best. I'll try to get it done sooner rather than later. Hope everybody has a good week, and I'll see you next week.